There was a time when one cookbook sat in nearly every American kitchen, its pages worn, stained, and trusted without question. Inside it lived recipes that fed millions, simple, strange, and unforgettable in ways people rarely talk about today. These weren't just meals. They were weeknight routines, Sunday traditions, and quiet moments shared around crowded tables. But something happened. One by one, these dishes began to disappear, slipping out of kitchens and fading from memory. Today, we're opening that forgotten chapter again, to uncover 10 Betty Crocker recipes that once defined American life and quietly vanished without anyone noticing. The first recipe feels almost impossible to believe today, yet for decades, it quietly existed in American kitchens without question. It was called tomato soup spice cake. At first glance, it sounds like a mistake. Tomato soup in a dessert? But during the 1940s and 1950s, this recipe made perfect sense. Canned goods were reliable, affordable, and always sitting in the pantry. And when fresh ingredients were limited or expensive, families learned to get creative. This cake wasn't about the tomato flavor. Once baked, the soup blended into the batter, adding moisture, richness, and a subtle depth that made the spices stand out even more. Cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg carried the flavor, while the soup worked quietly in the background, doing a job most people would never guess. For many families, this wasn't a novelty. It was a dependable dessert. Something a mother could prepare without a trip to the store. Something that felt warm, familiar, and just sweet enough to end a long day. But over time, as grocery stores filled with endless options and fresh ingredients became easier to find, recipes like this started to feel unnecessary, even strange. The idea of using soup in a cake slowly faded from everyday cooking. Today, tomato soup spice cake sounds like a curiosity from another era. But once, it was simply dinner table normal. And that might be the strangest part of all. The next recipe didn't just fade away. It left behind a kind of quiet confusion. It was known as perfection salad. Despite the name, there was nothing about it that resembles what we think of as a salad today. No leafy greens, no fresh dressing. Instead, it arrived at the table as a shimmering mold, translucent, carefully shaped, and filled with shredded cabbage, carrots, and sometimes even green peppers, all suspended inside flavored gelatin. To modern eyes, it feels more like a science experiment than a side dish. But in the 1930s and 1940s, this was elegance. This was progress. Gelatin dishes symbolized a new kind of kitchen, modern, efficient, and almost futuristic. Housewives took pride in unmolding these creations perfectly, serving them chilled, firm, and flawless. There was also a practical side. Ingredients were simple, inexpensive, and easy to store. During difficult years, especially around the time of the Great Depression, recipes like this made sense. They stretched what little families had while still presenting something that looked refined. But as decades passed, tastes began to shift. Fresh vegetables became more accessible, and the appeal of cold, gelatin-based dishes slowly disappeared. What once felt modern started to feel outdated, even unsettling. Today, perfection salad survives mostly in old cookbooks and fading memories. A dish that once represented the future now feels completely disconnected from it. The third recipe is one of the most curious illusions ever served on an American table. It was called mock apple pie. There were no apples in it, not a single slice. Instead, the filling was made from crushed crackers, usually Ritz crackers, mixed with sugar, lemon juice, and warm spices. Once baked inside a flaky crust, something unexpected happened. The texture softened, the flavors blended, and somehow, it tasted remarkably close to real apple pie. This wasn't a trick for novelty. It was born out of necessity. During times when fresh fruit was scarce or too expensive, families found ways to recreate familiar comforts using whatever they had. Crackers were cheap, shelf-stable, and always within reach. For many households, this pie became more than a substitute. It became tradition. Children grew up not questioning it, accepting it as just another version of something sweet and familiar. And for a moment, it worked. It filled the gap where something else was missing. But as grocery stores expanded and fresh produce became easier to find year-round, the need for imitation disappeared. The idea of using crackers in place of fruit slowly slipped into obscurity. Today, mock apple pie feels like a clever relic from a different kind of kitchen. A time when resourcefulness mattered more than authenticity, and when comfort could be created from almost nothing at all. The fourth recipe feels like something designed more for presentation than comfort, a dish that tried to turn something ordinary into something almost ceremonial. It was called the tuna noodle ring. At its center was a mixture of canned tuna, soft egg noodles, and a creamy sauce, usually bound together with condensed soup. But instead of being served straight from a pan, it was carefully shaped into a ring mold and baked until firm. Once turned out onto a plate, it formed a perfect circle, leaving an empty space in the middle that was often filled with peas, mushrooms, or extra sauce. It wasn't just about taste. It was about appearance. During the 1950s and 1960s, meals like this reflected a growing fascination with structure and control in the kitchen. Food wasn't just cooked, it was arranged, molded, and presented with intention. There was also a practical reason behind it. Canned tuna was inexpensive and widely available, making it a reliable protein for families trying to stretch their budgets. Combined with pantry staples, it created a meal that felt substantial without requiring much. For many households, this dish appeared at dinners where guests were present, something meant to impress without being complicated. It carried a quiet sense of pride. But over time, the appeal of molded meals began to fade. As cooking styles shifted towards simplicity and freshness, dishes like this started to feel overly constructed, even artificial. Today, the tuna noodle ring sits in old recipe cards, remembered more for its shape than its flavor. The fifth recipe didn't just disappear, it almost feels like it was quietly erased. It was called ham and banana hollandaise. On paper, it sounds like something that should never have existed. Whole bananas, wrapped in slices of baked ham, then covered in a warm, buttery hollandaise sauce. The flavors, sweet, salty, rich, combined in a way that feels completely out of place today. But in the 1950s, this wasn't considered strange. It was inventive. American kitchens were entering a period where convenience met experimentation. Canned sauces, pre-sliced meats, and imported fruits like bananas became symbols of a modern lifestyle. Combining them wasn't seen as unusual, it was seen as creative. There was also an element of presentation. This dish looked elegant when served. The glossy sauce, the neat arrangement, the contrast of colors. It gave the impression of something refined, even if the ingredients were simple. For families, it offered a way to break routine. A dinner that felt different from the usual, something that could surprise guests or make an ordinary evening feel slightly more special. But tastes change. As decades passed, the combination began to feel less adventurous and more confusing. The balance that once seemed exciting started to feel mismatched. Today, ham and banana hollandaise is rarely mentioned outside of vintage cookbooks. Not because it was forgotten entirely, but because it no longer fits the way people understand food anymore. The sixth recipe was once considered the height of comfort, something warm, creamy, and quietly dependable at the end of a long day. It was known as chicken à la king. Served over toast, rice, or biscuits, it brought together diced chicken, mushrooms, and sometimes peas, all folded into a thick, velvety cream sauce. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't complicated, but it filled the kitchen with a rich, steady aroma that meant dinner was ready. Its roots stretch back to the early 20th century, when dishes like this were often served in hotels and dining rooms, carrying a sense of quiet elegance. But by the 1940s and 1950s, it had moved into everyday homes, becoming a staple for families who wanted something both affordable and satisfying. Part of its popularity came from its flexibility. Leftover chicken could be transformed into something that felt entirely new. Pantry ingredients did most of the work, and the result was always consistent. For many, this dish became tied to routine. A dependable meal after long workdays, a familiar taste that didn't need explaining. It wasn't exciting, but it didn't have to be. But as time passed, heavy cream-based dishes began to fall out of favor. Lighter meals, faster recipes, and changing tastes slowly pushed it aside. Today, chicken a la king lingers in memory as a dish that once felt complete on its own. Quiet, filling, and somehow left behind without much notice. The seventh recipe feels almost like a symbol of post-war imagination. When cooks weren't just making dinner, they were building something new out of leftovers. It was called pineapple upside-down meatloaf. At first, it sounds like two completely different ideas forced into one dish. But in mid-century American kitchens, that kind of experimentation wasn't unusual. Canned pineapple had become widely available, and home cooks were constantly looking for ways to add sweetness, moisture, and a touch of color to everyday meals. The process was simple, yet strangely dramatic. A layer of pineapple rings was placed at the bottom of a pan, sometimes with maraschino cherries tucked into the centers. Then came the seasoned meatloaf mixture, pressed firmly on top. After baking, the whole thing was flipped, revealing a glossy, caramelized surface that looked almost festive. It wasn't just about flavor. It was about presentation. This was a time when meals were often expected to look as good as they tasted, especially when served to guests or during family gatherings. For a while it worked. The sweet and savory contrast felt modern, even bold. But as cooking trends shifted toward simplicity and clean flavors, this combination started to feel heavy, even confusing to newer generations. Today, pineapple upside-down meatloaf survives mostly in faded recipe cards and memory. A dish that once represented creativity in the kitchen now feels like a snapshot of a very different culinary world. The eighth recipe takes us into a quieter, more structured kind of dinner, the sort of meal that was planned with precision, not spontaneity. It was known as the 7-layer dinner. At first glance, it looked like a carefully stacked experiment. Raw ingredients were layered inside a heavy pot or baking dish: potatoes, carrots, onions, ground meat, tomatoes, and sometimes beans or cabbage, each placed one on top of the other with almost no mixing. Then the lid went on, and the entire dish was left to slowly cook for hours. There was something deeply practical about it. Families in the mid-20th century often needed meals that could cook themselves while attention was elsewhere. One pot, low heat, and time did the rest. No stirring, no complicated steps, just patience. But what made this dish interesting wasn't just convenience. It was the way it reflected trust in process. Each layer kept its identity while slowly blending into the others. By the end, everything had softened into a unified, hearty meal. It was especially common in working households, where time was limited and efficiency mattered more than presentation. The result wasn't meant to impress, it was meant to sustain. Over time, however, cooking began to move in a different direction. People wanted faster meals, fresher textures, and clearer separation of flavors. The idea of everything melting together in one pot started to feel outdated. Today, the 7-layer dinner remains a quiet reminder of a time when patience was the main ingredient. The 9th recipe feels less like a dish and more like a reflection of a specific era's fascination with color, texture, and convenience. It was known as the Jell-O vegetable mold. At the center of it all was gelatin, sweet or savory, depending on the version. Into this clear, trembling base were suspended chopped vegetables like carrots, celery, peas, and sometimes even olives or shredded cabbage. Once chilled, the mixture set into a firm, glassy mold that could be sliced and served like a centerpiece. It might seem unusual today, but during the mid-20th century, gelatin-based dishes were everywhere. They represented modern cooking, clean, controlled, and efficient. Refrigeration had become more common, and home cooks embraced anything that looked polished and required little active cooking time. There was also a visual appeal. These molds were often made for gatherings and holiday tables, where presentation mattered just as much as taste. A perfectly unmolded Jell-O creation was considered a small achievement in itself. But as time passed, food culture began to shift. People started valuing freshness over formality. Crisp vegetables lost their appeal when trapped inside a gelatin shell, and what once felt innovative began to feel restrictive. Eventually, these molded dishes quietly left everyday menus. Not because they failed completely, but because tastes simply moved on. Today, the Jell-O vegetable mold remains a striking reminder of a time when even dinner could feel like a carefully crafted sculpture. The final recipe brings us to something that once felt completely ordinary on American dinner tables, but now survives mostly in faded cookbooks and family memories. It is the vintage version of Swedish meatballs. In mid-century America, these meatballs were not the fast, modern versions people recognize today. They were richer, slower, and built with layers of flavor that came from butter, cream, and careful seasoning. The meat was often mixed with breadcrumbs, onions, and spices, then gently browned before being simmered in a thick, savory cream sauce. What made this dish so popular wasn't just taste, it was comfort. It arrived at the table warm and steady, usually served over egg noodles or mashed potatoes. It felt like something dependable, especially in households where meals were expected to stretch and satisfy. During the post-war years, dishes like this also reflected a growing interest in international cooking. American kitchens were becoming more open to global influences, but they still adapted everything to local ingredients and habits. The result was familiar, but slightly different from its original inspiration. Over time, however, lighter diets and faster cooking styles began to replace these heavier cream-based meals. What once felt like a staple slowly turned into an occasional nostalgia dish. Today, these meatballs remain one of the last echoes of that era, when dinner was slow, rich, and shared at a table where time seemed to move a little differently. These recipes were never just food, they were reflections of a time when kitchens worked with limits, imagination, and survival in mind. Some feel strange today, others almost unbelievable, but each one once had a place at the table. As tastes changed, they slipped quietly into cookbooks, forgotten drawers, and fading memories. But history has a way of lingering in flavor. The next time you open an old recipe card, remember, it might hold a story that once fed an entire generation. If you want more forgotten meals like these, subscribe and step back into the kitchens that time almost erased.